In this video, we're going to talk about the imperfect tense in Greek. In Greek, there are actually two past tenses. We have the imperfect and the aorist. In English, when we say past tense, we generally think of just one tense, and that's whenever a verb something is happening in the past. Well, the imperfect we're going to talk about is one of the two past tenses. Both of them describe action that's happening in the past, but the difference between the two is something that's called aspect. And we are going to begin talking about this phenomenon of aspect in this chapter. So for the imperfect, we're talking about continuous action. Generally, these verbs form with an ing in English, like she was running down the street. The aorist, which we're going to learn a little bit later, is undefined action, and generally in English, to denote undefined action, the suffix on the verb is an ed, like she walked down the street. So in English, both of those, we just call those the past tense. One is continuous, whereas the other is undefined. And just as we see in English, these are going to form a little differently. And this chapter, we're going to focus on the imperfect form. The imperfect signifies action that in itself is incomplete, hence the name imperfect, or something else might be happening during the action. In other words, sometimes the imperfect introduces or sets the stage, in a narrative especially, for something else that is happening that the author feels is very important. And when the aorist appears, generally it's simply indicating that the action happened, so it's very simple, it's undefined. It's just saying this happened without commenting more, perhaps on the duration of the action, or it's not necessarily, though it can, set the stage for explaining what else happened during the action. So the imperfect is continuous action, whereas the aorist, which we'll learn a little bit later, is undefined action. An example of the aorist would be, she went to the youth meeting. And we can pick out the verb here, it's went. She went to the youth meeting. So this is a form of go. It changes a little bit in English when you move it to the past tense. An imperfect would be, she was going to the youth meeting. And so it's kind of the same idea, but the difference is one of aspect. The imperfect here is continuous. She was going to the meeting. Well, when we say that in English, we're kind of asking ourselves already, what happened when she was going to the youth meeting? And this is an example of how the imperfect can set the stage for another kind of action or something else that happened in the story. So we might expect to hear something like, she was going to the youth meeting when her friend called her, and then a story develops. That's one of the main functions of the imperfect, just is continuous action. Oftentimes it introduces something else that's going along with the action. The difference between these two is something that's called aspect. The aspect is the kind of action. So the tense itself, the imperfect and the aorist tense, both of them are past tenses. The difference between the two is one of aspect. The imperfect represents an incomplete or non-perfected action from the author's perspective. And the context will often provide more details. When the imperfect is used, like I said, it can sometimes set the stage for or point us to other actions that are happening. Other times it's not. It's just the preferred past tense aspect that the author is using, and we shouldn't look for, oh, he's setting the stage, or the main point is not going to be found here in the imperfect verb because it's pointing to something else. Well, it can do that, and it functions like that often, but that's not its only function. To really be able to understand its function, we have to study the context, as is the case with really all verbs and all nouns. We always have to study the context to get a more precise understanding of their meaning. In English, to translate these, we generally provide the helping verb was along with the ing form of the verb. So she was going. Let's talk about how they form then. These are going to take an augment. An augment is something that in Greek signifies that the verb is past tense. So when we see the augment, we should automatically think, okay, this is a past tense verb. And then we'll see the stem of the verb along with the connecting vowel. And the imperfect, now we're getting into the secondary endings. There's 24 total verbal endings. We've already studied the primary endings. The present tense and the future tense use those. The perfect tense, when we study that, we'll see that it also uses the primary. The secondary endings are used specifically for past tenses. So let's take a look at this form. We're going to use the stem leg, which means I speak. So the augment generally is an epsilon. The stem of the verb would be leg. The connecting vowel in this case is omicron. And the secondary, the first person singular secondary ending is nu. And the meaning here would be I was speaking. So lego means I speak. If it's elegon, we see the augment and we see the secondary ending, then okay, this is an imperfect, so we'll include the helping verb was and the ing form of the verb I was speaking. Another thing I want to point out, the stem, leg, that's exactly like that forms straight from the present tense stem. As we start studying other verbs, we'll find that sometimes the stem changes a little bit. We talked about that in the last chapter. But the stem for the imperfect will always be exactly the same as the present tense stem. Something that we want to try to, a little phrase we want to memorize and understand is this. The stem of the imperfect always forms from the present tense stem. So they always are going to look alike. The augment and the secondary ending are always used with the past tenses, and they will always appear together. So what we're saying is up there in the augment, the epsilon in this case, along with the secondary ending nu for the first person singular, they're always going to go together. The augment always goes with the secondary ending because both of them always signify a past tense, so they're always going to go together. For consonants, the augment is going to be epsilon. So we start with lego, that's the lexical form, and then in the imperfect tense it would be elegon. The augment plus the secondary ending, and that would be I was speaking. If a verb starts with a consonant, the augment is going to be an epsilon. But we have a big handful of verbs that start with a vowel, and when that happens, the vowel lengthens. So if we have a verb like akuo, it's going to lengthen, and in this case it would change to an eta, and it would be ekuon. And that doesn't quite look like akuo, might throw us off, but that's where we have to memorize this rule. If the verb starts with a vowel and there's an augment, we're not going to throw an epsilon in front of the alpha. It's actually going to lengthen to ekuon, and that would mean I was hearing. We have some verbs that start with diphthongs, in other words, two vowels. And eurisko is one of those, the epsilon and the upsilon. And this goes either way. Sometimes you'll see the vowel lengthened, as in euriskon, that first form there. Sometimes it doesn't change at all, and it's just euriskon. The epsilon stays epsilon. And the way we have to determine if it's imperfect is by looking at, not necessarily the augment in this case, but the secondary ending. And then we have some compound verbs. Verbs that start with a preposition, and then they have the verbal stem. And it's like peri pateo as an example. Peri pateo, this means I walk around, generally, or I live, it could be. It's composed of peri plus pateo. So generally what happens is the augment is added not in front of the preposition part of the word, it's added in front of the verbal stem. So we have the preposition, and then notice here we have peri epatun as the imperfect form, which means I was walking. The epsilon's kind of in the middle there. Well, what happens in compound verbs, the epsilon is added after the preposition, but before the verbal stem. Peri epatun. So let's take a look at the forms in the active voice. The first person singular would be elegon. That forms from the augment plus the stem plus the connecting vowel plus the ending. And the translation would be I was speaking. Again, how do we know that the person is I? How do we know to put I in our translation? It'll be because of the ending. Remember, the ending on verbs shows us both the person and the number. Person would be I, first person singular, and the number, well, it's singular. So if it has the nu, I was speaking. Eleges has that sigma ending, and this would be translated you were speaking. And then we have elegen with a movable nu. Sometimes it will appear, sometimes it won't. Technically it doesn't have an ending, but sometimes to facilitate pronunciation, if the following verb, let's say, starts with a consonant, then it will not appear. If it starts with a vowel, just to enunciate well, it'll usually have the nu. He, she, or it was speaking. Elegomen. Okay, we've got the augment again, the stem, connecting vowel, the ending would be men. That's the same as the primary ending. We were speaking. Elegete would be you were speaking. And elegon, they were speaking. If you compare this form, elegon, with the first person singular form, elegon, there's no change. And so it's the question will be answered purely by studying the context. So the 6 forms are elegon, eleges, elegen, elegomen, elegete, elegon. And the endings for the active voice here would be nu and sigma and nothing, sometimes a movable nu. Then we'd have men, te, and then nu again. These would be the middle passive forms of the imperfect, and we're going to use pistuo to illustrate. We know what pistuo means. That means I believe. But this form, epistuamen, has the augment, and then it has a connecting vowel. And the middle passive ending for the secondary tense, this is a little different. It's main. Now we've already seen my, but now it starts with a mu, so it's similar in that way, but it's main. Epistuamen means I was believed. Epistou would mean you were believed. And the sigma drops out, and then there's a contraction, and that's why the ending looks the way it does. Epistueta would be he, she, or it was believed. Epistuametha would be we were believed. Epistueste, you were believed. And epistuanta, they were believed. So the forms we have here are epistuamen, epistuu, epistueta, epistuametha, epistueste, epistuanta. And in the book, I think all of the forms of lu are listed. The endings, again, let's review the endings. The first singular for the middle passive voice would be main, and then we have sa, and then we have ta. And then it's metha, ste, nta. We want to memorize all of these new endings, and once we do have them memorized, we'll have all of the verbal endings for the indicative memorized. So here's a quick review. Now we've studied the endings for the primary tenses, and with the study of the imperfect, we've learned one of the 2 past tenses, which always take the secondary endings. These are called the secondary tenses or secondary endings. And so let's review all of these. We've got luo, lues, lue, luamen, luete, luusin. And then if it's middle passive, it would be luomai, lue, luetai, luametha, luesthe, and luantai. And so for the secondary tenses, we just studied the imperfect. This is what lua would look like with the augment and the endings. We'd have eluan, so that would be I was loosing. Elues, you were loosing. Eluen, he, she, it was loosing. Eluamen, we were loosing. Eluete, you or you all were loosing. And eluan, they were loosing. Again, eluan and eluan share the same form. The context will be what helps us translate it correctly. And then we've got the middle passive voices. Eluamen, that would be I was being loosed. Eluu, you were being loosed. Elueta, he, she, it was being loosed. Eluametha, we were being loosed. Eluesthe, you all were being loosed. And eluanta, they were being loosed.